Look at the level of academic achievement in the freest nation on earth and what's happening with our with not only with what we are teaching children, but also what we are teaching children about the scientific method.
Mhm.
Like I think those ideas, at least in this country, are getting further and further and further separated from the inputs that would be necessary to achieve this goal sooner rather than later.
Is well, if we could put a colony on Mars, that would be a good step in that process.
The first step. So I've got a couple thoughts there. I think
Now
right now
yeah,
we are
well
probably further away from accomplishing a colony on Mars with the goal of getting humanity to the point where we are a spacefaring civilization. I think we are probably further away from that than we were 10 years ago. Because as I conceptualize the inputs, the academic inputs for people coming up who will eventually fill these positions in SpaceX, in NASA, in whatever the Russian space agency is, in the Chinese space agency. The okay, the Iranians teach advanced mathematics so intensely at a young age that I was just watching an interview with a young woman named Nina Infinity. And I say young woman, I think she's like 2 years older than me. Her parents moved from Iran when she was like 10 to Canada, and now she lives in Mexico with her husband. And she said that when she came to Canada as a 10-year-old in 1995, that she was more familiar with calculus than the kids several grades above her, and the teachers asked her to tutor other students. Look at the level of academic achievement in the freest nation on earth and what's happening with our with not only with what we are teaching children, but also what we are teaching children about the scientific method.
mhm.
Like I think those ideas, at least in this country, are getting further and further and further separated from the inputs that would be necessary to achieve this goal sooner rather than later.
Mhm.
That's my first thought. Like I think we as a culture have not done a good job incentivizing higher level mathematics, higher level scientific achievement, higher level logical thinking, higher level scientific thinking, right? You start with a hypothesis.
Mhm.
You identify what steps you would have to be true, what would have to be not true in order for that hypothesis to be false, right? You have to disprove the null hypothesis. That is the basic foundational element of any scientific method. And then you test that hypothesis. And to the extent that it is true, you then have a theory. You then use that theory to make predictions about how other things are going to work. And
Mhm.
great, that's the scientific method in a nutshell. And that is actively being corrupted for whatever reason. That's not what people are getting out of school. That's not what people are getting in the quality that they need from American institutions at the moment. What they're getting is diversity quotas. What they're getting is outrage politics. What they're getting is indoctrination. What they're getting is this weird effusion of gender ideology into our academic institutions that are informing people's understanding of the world, not in a way that is conducive to a broader understanding of life and the ability to experience life on other worlds. Right. So that's my first thought. My second thought is that the issues that we would be exporting into space are not, I think, well served in isolation. Like our population is probably several hundred million people less than we actually think. The
Hmm.
Chinese recently admitted like they've overcounted their population by like 120 million over the past several decades. Right? So the number of people that we think we have on Earth probably less than we imagine, and the industrial inputs into agriculture are waning because it's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. Those are the three fertilizers. A lot
Hmm.
of well, I mean, the majority of the world's potash that the U.S. imports comes from Canada. We're pretty good on nitrogen and phosphorus ourselves, but like Ukraine and Russia, for instance,
Hmm.
those are two pretty big actors in the global food supply chain.
Right, 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 right.
The other consequence of this push to get us away from fossil fuels and towards more renewable energy, which sounds great until you realize that uh, once you burn the, once you harvest methane, the as a byproduct of like oil sands, like the shale oil. Once you harvest that methane, right, there are processes that you can put it through to turn it into fertilizer. As we are toning down those processes, the amount of fertilizer available, the amount of fertilizer that will go into, say, places like Africa, places like Europe, places like China, to make what they have into arable land, those are going to decrease. So
Hmm.
the potential for a global famine that probably isn't going to affect the US very much because we have the best farmland on earth and we're surrounded by oceans and trading partners that we aren't at war with.
Hmm.
The consequences of those things are that there's going to be a lot of death in places like Africa, in places like Europe, in places like Asia. And before we export those challenges to space, before we try to go and create new problems for ourselves to solve, there really does need to be a reckoning with why are we producing a generation of people who is less scientifically literate than the generation that preceded it, despite having access to technology that 20 years ago would have seemed more akin to magic, or let's say 2 generations ago would have seemed
Hmm.
more akin to magic than something that's actually
Real.
available, widely available, right? Going to Mars
Well, you got to remember, this is his goal,
seems
right?
dumb.
Like the moral of the story, though, is that that's his thing,
Hmm.
right? Our like my thing is to build leaders so that we don't export our bullshit up.